So this is the first video that I'm recording in a series of videos on the insulin cases from the Lucy Letby trial and conviction. And the reason that I'm doing these first is they're clearly very critical in the case as a whole. I think, well, I could see, I think, even on the very first day that I heard about this, it was clear to me before I got involved and before I started to research this and invest myself in it, I needed to know about the insulin cases because that seemed like something that wasn't going to be easy to brush away because there should be physical evidence, there should be some clear indication that insulin has been given, etc., etc. I could see quite early on, within a couple of hours probably of hearing about this, maybe less than a couple of hours, that some of the other allegations were pretty shaky. Let's be generous. I mean, obviously, over time they've become more and more shaky, but I could see that they were not necessarily very solid. I obviously didn't know anything about the insulin cases initially. I just knew that there was this accusation of poisoning with insulin. I didn't know about the historical context. I didn't even really know that other nurses had been to prison. It's not something that I'd hugely paid attention to. But it was very clear to me from the start that the insulin cases were one of three key items of evidence. I think within a couple of days, I was already clear, and I still believe this today, that there are three key items of, in terms of, when I say key items, in terms of convincing the jury, three key items of evidence in securing a conviction. The first one is the confession note, so-called confession note, I should say. That's very important because it establishes in the mind of the jury, look, she said she did it. People said that online all the time. They still say it intermittently now. But you would always encounter people saying, oh, of course she killed the baby. She said she did it. So that confession note is critical. And I think that was one area where the defence did a very bad job because you cannot allow the prosecution to walk into court and say, oh, look, the defendant has confessed. You've got to tear that note up. And I thought they did very weak defence on that point. There's so much more that they could have done that they didn't do. I'll be getting into that more actually in these series of videos. Eventually, I'll obviously move on to discuss the confession and the anecdotal evidence in the case. But all of these three items are interlinked and they form a kind of bonded case on which she convicted. The second key item of evidence is the infamous shift chart, because that is saying, oh, look, it couldn't possibly have been anyone else. So now you already have, it couldn't possibly be anyone else, and she's confessed to it. Now, of course, we know now, I mean, pretty early on, I could see that shift chart could be completely wrong. Then, obviously, over time, it's become more and more clear that it is wrong. But in the eyes of the jury, they're just being told, and I'm not sure to what extent they're even allowed to question this information because they're not allowed to do their own independent research. That's contempt of court. So they almost have to accept this at face value, that Lucy Letby, oh look, she was on duty for all the incidents. Of course, we know now that's completely untrue, and we know there are other collapses, we know there are other infants, etc., etc. So this gives a completely misleading impression, but the jury now has the impression she's always on duty, it could only have been Lucy across all these cases, and she's confessed to it. And then the third thing, of course, is the insulin cases that we're going to discuss in these videos. And the reason these are particularly important is it gives some physical manifestation that there's been harm on the unit. All these things about, oh, she could have injected air, she could have put milk in, or she could have done this, she could have done that. Clearly, that is all absolutely circumstantial. This was the only aspect of the court case that got even remotely close to being concrete. Even then, we know it's not concrete. This is an entirely circumstantial case. Even the Court of Appeal says it's a circumstantial case. So this isn't actually concrete evidence, but it's the closest that the prosecution came to offering some sort of concrete proof or concrete item that can be pointed to that can be deemed to have solidity. And I think there is then several reasons why the insulin cases are important. Firstly, there were unanimous verdicts on these cases. So in many of the other cases on which he was convicted, at least one member of the jury said, well, I think there's reasonable doubt. I don't know why there wasn't. I mean, I was thinking about this today. I really believe, and it's very hard for me to say how I'd react if I was in a jury for this case or any other, but I fundamentally believe that if you're going to put someone away for murder and you're going to put them away for the rest of their lives, there has to be something more than just saying, oh, well, it could have been this, there could have been this could be the explanation, and, she was there a lot of the time, so she had the opportunity to do it. We don't have any evidence that she did it, but, she could have done it because she was sort of there some of the time. And, we've got these figures that say the deaths are consistent with, it's not a diagnostic, but I mean, it could have been this possibly. There you go, we've put all that together. I think I would always say there's reasonable doubt. I think to put someone away for murder, there should be either concrete evidence or there needs to be very strong, if not concrete evidence, I'd say ideally there should be concrete evidence, but if not concrete evidence, there should be very strong circumstantial evidence, scientific evidence in particular, or medical evidence, that says it couldn't possibly be anything else. And then if you're going to raise a circumstantial case, you have to be able to say, look, this was the only person that had the opportunity to do it. There is no other possible explanation for this. Then I might consider convicting. But for something it's like, oh, it's possibly this is the case, and oh, it's all a bit strange, and oh, look, statistically she was there a bit more than other people, I'm pretty sure I would have said, well, there's reasonable doubt. But we have to be very certain to put this person away for the rest of her life, and it's clear that there's very significant doubt. That's even if you just accept the prosecution case at face value. Of course, we now know the prosecution case is full of holes, but even if we didn't know that, I still believe that I wouldn't convict based on what I've seen in this case, because there's always going to be reasonable doubt. But the closest there was to any concrete evidence was the Insulin cases. Now, I just want to highlight this in this article. So, a lot is often made of the fact that Lucy supposedly accepted that someone was poisoned with insulin. Obviously, this is utterly ridiculous because Lucy's not in any position to challenge that information. It would be like saying, I remember there's like a humorous bit, a bit of comedy from Bill Hicks where he's talking about dinosaurs, and he's talking about someone going up to Jesus, to God, and being asked whether they're being asked if they're going to get into heaven or not, and God says to them, "What about dinosaurs? Do you believe in dinosaurs?" And the person's going, "Well, of course. I mean, there's fossils and everything." And like the joke is like, he goes, "You idiot! I was just testing your faith. They weren't really dinosaurs. Do you think they were flying lizards? What a load of rubbish." Now, obviously, there really were dinosaurs, and most people believe that. But if scientists told you something completely different, if a paleontologist said, "Yeah, of course there aren't lizards that can fly, and of course there weren't. That's just a myth. Like dragons are a myth, obviously." Then what choice would you have other than to accept that? And that's the situation, Lucy. Obviously, as it stands today, I've been to the Natural History Museum. I've seen dinosaurs. I've seen dinosaur bones. I've seen the skeletons. I've read a fair bit about it, so I'm quite interested in it. I'm ready to accept, even though I've not seen concrete evidence myself, that dinosaurs existed. I think it's reasonable to assume that. But I don't know for certain. I couldn't say with 100% certainty. It seems 99.99% likely, and I'm ready to accept the word of scientists, of course. And that's the position Lucy was put in. Lucy was put in a position where they said, look, we know these babies were poisoned with insulin. It's not like she was saying, making an allegation herself. She was just told, this is definitely the case, and she went, fair enough, but I didn't do it. So this is exactly what happened with these other nurses. And that's why the statistical case is so important. That's why you get these idiots saying, oh, it wasn't a statistical case. I will address that fully in future videos, but it's the only way, literally the only way, that you can say Lucy Letby is guilty is because of this chart. This chart here that says she's always on duty. Because she said exactly the same thing as the other nurses. All of the other nurses that they questioned, these three other nurses that must have been on duty or that can be linked with it in some way, they just said, oh, I didn't give him insulin. Lucy said exactly the same thing. But there's no evidence that she did it whatsoever. Obviously, we're going to go into the insulin case in depth and look at every single aspect of it. But it is hung on the fact that even the insulin cases that have some degree of physical proof, although we know now it's very flawed physical evidence, even the insulin cases are hung on the fact that she was present all the time. Because otherwise, why can't it be one of these three other nurses? Why can't it be one of them that poisoned child F? Because they're not in this shift chart. They're not the purple column. It has to be the person in the purple column because that's our case. And so that's why these three things together are so important. And the insulin case is a very important pillar of the entire prosecution case. And there's two further things I'm going to mention. Are firstly, I'm going to go into this in a second, but there's a lot of this video will be dealing with the historical precedent related to insulin. So I really want to deal with these cases in the most depth that I possibly can. So I'm going to split these insulin cases into several parts. I don't know how many parts yet, but in this first video, I just want to look at the background to the insulin cases, the history related to insulin and nurses allegedly poisoning, but actually being wrongfully convicted clearly, and the precedent that's involved. I think this plays a role in the public mind as well, that infants can be poisoned with insulin. And I think, to be honest, I've thought about this as well. I think if Lucy had been charged on these two cases alone, just the two insulin cases, I mean, my way of hearing about, I didn't follow the trial. I heard about this on the day of the verdict. And I came downstairs, heard it on the radio, initially was shocked. And I was listening for half an hour and all these things are happening. I must have reasonable intuition because I started to think, well, there's some pretty extraordinary claims here and I haven't heard any evidence for them. I think if it was just a couple of insulin poisonings, I probably would have turned the radio off, gone back upstairs and never given any further consideration. I think there was something that made me think, what, she poisoned infants with milk? Really? And like air. I'd never heard of that before, really. But to poison an infant with milk immediately just seemed very implausible to me. But regardless of whether it was plausible or not, they were very extraordinary claims, and there were a lot of claims, and it was a lot of infants. And initially, for that first half an hour, I was pretty shocked, and I just couldn't leave the kitchen. It was like I was meant to be there. It was like, I don't know if I really believe in destiny, but it felt like it was destined. And I think if it had just been the insulin cases alone, because I may have been vaguely aware that's happened in the past, and it seems like a more plausible allegation, I think things would not have advanced in this case as quickly as they have, and as definitively as they have. I think a lot of it is because they put so much crap in court, people woke up to it pretty quickly. Like for me, it took half an hour, and then I was literally standing there in the kitchen thinking, right, well, I need to hear some evidence for this. Another 5 minutes would pass, no evidence. Another 5 minutes, like, right, I'm going to look for the evidence myself. And then I would have seen this confession note pretty early on. I was like, I mean, come on. There's no way that is a confession. It's absolutely ridiculous. So, as I say, in this video, I'm going to discuss the historical precedent of these cases and some previous cases in the past where nurses have been accused of poisoning people with insulin. One of whom is very important because his case is coming up on appeal in the very near future. So we can now finally view the New Yorker article, the infamous New Yorker article online. And one of the points made by Rachel Aviv in this exceptional piece of journalism is about the Lucy de Burke case. And she notes here, Tom Dirksen in his book about Lucy de Burke used the analogy of a train. The locomotives were two cases in which there had been allegations of poisoning. Another 8 cases involving children who suddenly became ill on de Burke's shifts were the wagons, trailing along because of a belief that all the deaths couldn't have occurred by chance. The locomotives in the Letby prosecution were the insulin cases, which were charged as attempted murders. The fact that there were 2 deliberate poisonings with insulin, Nick Johnson, the prosecutor, said, will help you when you are assessing whether the collapses and deaths of other children on the neonatal unit were because somebody was sabotaging them or whether these were just tragic coincidences. So just to pick up on that last point, firstly, it's not even that these were coincidences. That suggests a really unlikely set of statistical events. We know now that they weren't even particularly unlikely. That there were a large number of deaths, and it was some people believe that it was a significant statistical spike, and some people don't. But it wasn't that much worse than the second. I think it's been proven that they were statistically the worst hospital in that year, but it wasn't that much worse than the second worst hospital. And then the reason as well that it's not some enormously unlikely coincidence is that Lucy simply worked more shifts. So therefore, it's hardly surprising that even with this bizarre selection of cases that was used, that we'll get into in future videos, the nurse that does the most shifts, you'd expect to see her there for more collapses. It's not even that there were tragic coincidences it's put here, let alone even if they were tragic coincidences, should that be a reason to prosecute? Obviously, it's the job of the prosecution to use any dirty tricks they can, and God knows they used a lot of them in this case. But the broader point here is that the insulin cases were critical to this court case, and I would argue that they wouldn't have reached court without the alleged insulin poisonings, because I think that the other charges are so phenomenally weak and the science is so poor that I just don't think he would have got to court. Of course, that's speculative and we'll never know, but this article establishes the principle that the insulin cases are absolutely critical to the Lucy Letby conviction. And then the other topic and the other significant factor that's going to be the subject of this video is, as I've mentioned, that there is precedent from previous cases, and I feel that must have played a role in this conviction, and perhaps in the mentality of the jury even going into the case. So there is precedent for this use of insulin in cases involving nurses. I'm going to talk about a case shortly that people watching this video are more likely to know about, but I want to start by looking at the case of Deborah Windsor, or Dee Windsor as she's more commonly known. Now, I was fortunate enough to spend several hours recently with the gentleman who was involved in the CCRC application for Dee Windsor. I had lunch with him in Manchester, and while we did have a few beers, we also discussed a lot of important issues. And one of them was this case. He also worked on the Colin Norris case that I'm going to go on to discussing shortly. Now, he told me that in both of these cases, he has absolutely no doubt whatsoever that they're innocent. The Dee Windsor case is not as well known as the Colin Norris case, but she was also a nurse. And I'll just briefly read from the Criminal Cases Review Commission here. Deborah Windsor was convicted in July 2000 of murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment. The CCRC received an application for review of the conviction in June 2005. Miss McCarthy had been convicted of the murder of her husband, who had been found unconscious and hypoglycemic. He was taken to hospital but did not regain consciousness. Hospital laboratory tests revealed that Mr. McCarthy had a very high insulin level and an unmeasurable level of C-peptide. The prosecution case at trial had been that Mr. McCarthy's hypoglycemia must have resulted from the administration of a large dose of insulin, and that Miss McCarthy alone had the opportunity to do this. In addition, Miss McCarthy was a nurse, had both access to insulin and the skills to inject it. So that's really the background of the case. So I want to spend a little bit of time discussing this. So this is firstly a review of a book in the British Medical Journal from 2007. A new book chronicles insulin's 50-year history as a murder weapon, including stories of doctors engaged in foul play. This was authored by Vincent Marks, who was a world expert on this, described here as a world authority on criminal use of insulin. Now, he was involved in Dee Windsor's case, and he was involved in Colin Norris's case. This wasn't the person that I met, because Vincent Marks sadly passed away fairly recently. I've heard that he's very much an admired man by people that knew him, and I've spoken to a few people that knew him. There is a very good story about him that you might hear about at one time, because I might interview the person that told me that story, and I might ask him to tell you it. I'll save it for that occasion. Actually, I've heard a couple. I've heard there's another one as well. So you might get to hear both stories, but I mean, I think he's fair to say he's quite a character. So anyway, the critical thing here is, I'll read the last few paragraphs. Most fascinating is the recent case of Deborah Windsor, a nurse convicted in 2000 of murdering her husband by insulin injection on the basis of a controversial immunoassay test, and despite evidence of vomiting, a circumstance unheard of in insulin-induced hypoglycemia. Courageously casting doubt on the test he himself spearheaded, and indeed on the interpretation of his own colleagues who provided the critical result, Marx suggests that Windsor was wrongly convicted. Tellingly, with the benefit of 50 years' research on insulin measurement, Marks concludes that none of the available tests are sufficiently accurate on their own to provide a safe conviction of murder unless backed by mass spectrometry. Since Marks is probably unavailable for dinner party guest turns, his and Richmond's powerful and enlightening book makes a gripping substitute. So there's some strong evidence there. Obviously, we're going to go on to discuss the specifics of Lucy's case in later videos, but I mean, this obviously refers to the testing, and very, very important here that Vincent Marks, who provided some of the evidence for the court case, later went on to say, well, look, you need to understand that this is not satisfactory to convict this person, and he in fact believed that Dee Windsor was innocent. Now, I'm sure at the time he couldn't possibly have guessed that this would become such a significant ruling in many ways. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on the entire history of the British legal system, but I think this was kind of a landmark case. I don't know if there were prior allegations of nurses poisoning with insulin, but certainly we've seen this pattern that was established in 2000 that has been used ever since. And this was one of the things that the person I spoke with told me. You know, he said, it's particularly egregious that this has been going on for 20 years and we've been telling the court system over and over again, this is not acceptable, it doesn't have forensic merit, it doesn't have value, and yet people are still being convicted today on this thing that was known about now over 20 years ago. And that's interesting that the legal system is so intransigent in this regard. Now, I don't know whether this is still being cited as precedent, but it certainly provides a precedent for things that have occurred since then. So if we move on to the next article, this is also about the Dee Windsor case. And this was in the Daily Mail in April 2007. And it goes on to explain the likelihood that this case is highly flawed. It's not only the testing, there are also other circumstances that make it phenomenally unlikely, just from a logistical perspective, that Dee Windsor carried out this alleged crime. This is actually an interesting point in Lucy's case, that there's a very good reason why insulin is very rarely used in murder cases. The victim doesn't usually die. Now, in this case, unfortunately, her husband did die. Obviously, we know I'll make this clear later on in the video if people don't know, but in the insulin cases from the Lucy Letby case, neither infant actually died. So that would again beg the question of why she decided to switch murder weapons when she supposedly managed to be successful with air and air embolisms. As you see here, it's even a matter of dispute whether their husband died of hyperglycemia. It says here, in the years since Dee's conviction, there has been growing awareness of autonomic dysreflexia, a condition that can occur in patients with severe spinal cord injury, so genetic and other issues as well. There's no motive here. In the end, the prosecution admitted they could not offer any reason why Dee might have wanted to murder Nick, so she's murdering someone for no reason. She doesn't benefit in any way. Quite the opposite. This is talking here about Vincent Marks criticising the verdict. When Dee was found guilty, a barrister, David Hooper, wrote that he had an unease about the verdict I've never felt in a previous case. They accepted, talking about the appeal, they accepted the crime was an unlikely one, but the judge still rejected the appeal in 2002. This is talking here about some of the logistics and the alibi that she had. It's pretty incredible, but yet she was still found guilty. They still rejected appeals. There's more here, a clash of conviction. Dee Windsor is serving life for the murder of her husband, but was it really murder? This is the same journalist, I believe, Bob Woffington, writing in The Guardian a couple of years earlier. Again goes over all the details related to the case and why it's so unlikely that this occurred. Before you even go into the problems with the testing that's similar with Lucy's case, and yet she served her entire sentence. And we see here in December 2020, after the Criminal Cases Review Commission, I quoted from their document earlier in this section, they did refer the case. They referred the case in 2016. The Court of Appeal just rejected it. And one thing that I was told by this gentleman that I met, who very kindly gave me his time, was that in the case of Dee Windsor, and in the case we're going to look into next, Colin Norris, there was literally just him and Vincent Marks speaking on behalf of these defenders and these people that are wrongfully convicted. Now, the good thing in Lucy's case is we have an enormous panel of people and more people are coming forward. So hopefully that will be helpful. But the criminal justice system is incredibly intransigent. It doesn't like admitting that it made a mistake. And in this case, they've referred, the Criminal Cases Review Commission has referred this case, and they say, in summary, we do not see how the fresh evidence can serve to dilute the medical case against the appellant or transform its perspective. The new evidence does not provide any ground for allowing the appeal. I mean, that must be very upsetting. And I was told she's just given up now. She's served a sentence, she's come out of prison, she's just got to get on with it and be considered a guilty person for the rest of her life. So I don't think there'll be any further appeals in this case. Obviously, that's not good precedent. It's deeply unsatisfactory when it's very unlikely that this is a conviction. I don't know how it can be allowed to go to court in the first place. I don't know how the police are allowed to run roughshod over these cases and make these assertions, or how the medical evidence comes to light and why they don't consider alternatives and why they don't seek second opinions, etc., etc. But they don't seem to do so, and it seems the Court of Appeal is extremely reluctant to overturn cases. We know this to be the case anyway. In Lucy's case, I'm very confident this case is going to be referred by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. We're then up against a very tough system in terms of the Court of Appeal. And I don't think we can delude ourselves about that. We need to be realistic that they have rejected appeals of innocent people countless times. They rejected all the appeals of Andrew Malkinson, who was demonstrably innocent. He was denied evidence that would have exonerated him. Hopefully, that will create a climate in which they more seriously look at the evidence in Lucy's case, and for that matter, in cases in the future. But the fact is, this person, Dee Windsor, was a nurse. She supposedly, allegedly, poisoned her husband for absolutely no reason. There are massive problems with it. There are massive logistical problems. Experts have come forward to say this should be disallowed, and yet, for some bizarre reason, it's been allowed. At some point, I'm going to hopefully assess the Unheard Live debate and go through the arguments that were made by the people that wish to agree with the prosecution. I can't do that currently because there are copyright issues. It will depend on whether Unheard ever post the full video on YouTube, which they hopefully will. If they do, then I'll be all over it and I will demolish everything that they said. One of the things they said was they actually cited this case. They obviously didn't know that much about it because one of them was saying Deborah Windsor over and over again, not even knowing that she's more correctly referred to as Dee Windsor. Everyone refers to as Dee Windsor. One of these articles says that. I mean, basically, he's Googled something and he's reading it out. I think I'm right in saying that he made basic fundamental mistakes. But anyway, I'll get onto that at some point in the future. But the point is, it's not a good thing that someone who's demonstrably innocent did not have the appeal, the case overturned on appeal. And Colin Norris has had appeals rejected, even though the jurors from the original case are saying that it's a miscarriage of justice. 2 jurors have come out and said, yeah, we made a mistake. We didn't have the evidence available for that matter at the time. This is a likely miscarriage of justice. He's likely innocent. It's not a good thing if people like that are kept in prison. But you could, yes, in a technical sense, it can be considered a safe conviction. But I don't care whether the legal system considers something safe. The question is, what actually happened in the real world, because the legal system considered the conviction of Andrew Malkinson to be safe. Then they rejected one appeal. Then they rejected a second appeal. Then they rejected a third appeal. So all the way through the legal system, that is considered to be a safe conviction. Andrew Malkinson served his entire sentence. There was only one minor problem. He wasn't at the crime scene and literally physically could not have committed the crime. And later he was exonerated. Maybe, who knows, maybe they'll actually give him some compensation one day. So the fact that a conviction is considered safe is really of no relevance when you have experts saying, look, this is completely wrong. And that's what we see in the case of Dee Windsor, and that's what we're about to see in the case of Colin Norris. And it's important for me to emphasise these cases are the same. The same criticisms, exactly the same criticisms, are being made as have been made in relation to Lucy Letby. We can only hope, given the litany of disasters that have occurred in the criminal justice system, and the fact that Colin Norris's appeal is coming up shortly, we can only hope that the system learns from the egregious mistakes that it's made in the past. So I move on now to the case of Colin Norris. There are many parallels in this case with Lucy Letby, most notably that Colin Norris is a nurse accused of poisoning patients with insulin. In this case, it's elderly people, not babies. And was found guilty, has been incarcerated, always maintained his innocence. And there are many other similarities which I'll go through during this section. I want to scroll down here to Ethel Hall. So there's several aspects to the investigation that are odd and unsatisfactory, but in a lot of these cases, and I think a lot of criminal cases, it would appear, they really tend to either hinge on or be amplified by some item of anecdotal evidence that a critical thinker would dismiss as absolutely worthless. And in this case, so in Lucy's case, we've got all these diaries, and the diary clearly has no value whatsoever. Unlike in some cases, like Lucinda Burke and Kathleen Folbig, the diary entries are more substantial. I think in Lucy's case, it's more the notes, although the police mention the diaries, but I mean, they seem to have backed it. Even though it's still mentioned by the Crown Prosecution Service, they've largely backed away from them because there's just nothing in there. And then, there's other things like that, Facebook searches and handover sheets. And here, there's this comment made with regard to Ethel Hall that I predict 5:15 a.m. as being the time Ethel Hall will become well, since he had a feeling about her. He thought that Hall was going off tonight and that he was a jinx in the hospital. So just the kind of remarks that can happen in a workplace sometimes, like if you analysed everything that everyone said in every workplace, particularly one in which there's ill patients, you could make anyone look bad. It's just some flippant remark that's been made, and it shouldn't be obviously cited as meaningful evidence that Colin Norris has murdered people. So the reason we're looking at this case in particular is that it's recently been referred to the Court of Appeal. There's an application made to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and it's been referred to the Court of Appeal in February 2021. And I'm sure quite a few people watching this will know that the appeal hearing's beginning in May. I think it's on the 6th of May. And I think it will last approximately a month. So you have to be in prison for 16 years. And then they just decided, oh yeah, actually, you shouldn't have done that. So I begin by just looking at this paper that's authored by a name that may be familiar to you, Alan Wayne Jones. He's talking about insulin murders. I'll just read the abstract of this. Although insulin is an essential medicine and a life-saving drug, it has also been incriminated in many poisoning deaths, accidental, suicidal, and some with malicious intent. Overdosing with insulin precipitates a life-threatening state of hypoglycemia, and if untreated leads to coma, irreversible brain damage, and death. Normally the pancreatic S cells secrete equimolar amounts of insulin and C-peptide into the portal venous blood. Now, I've just made a note that equimolar means having or relating to an equal number of moles or having the same molar concentration. In simpler terms, it describes mixtures or solutions where the components are present in the same ratio based on their molar mass. I've just looked at molar concentration as well here. It's simply the measure of the concentration of a chemical species, in particular a solute, in a solution. So when they're talking about equimolar amount of insulin, it's just the amount in the solution, essentially, and there's an equal, and it's saying these pancreatic cells secrete an equal amount into the venous blood. Although under physiological conditions, the plasma concentration ratio is less than unity because insulin is more susceptible to hepatic first-pass metabolism. I won't explain all of these terms. A high ratio of insulin C-peptide in plasma from a poisoned patient is compelling evidence that pharmaceutical insulin was administered, which does not contain C-peptide. The analysis for insulin and C-peptide was traditionally done by immunoassay methods, although high-resolution LC-MS, referring to liquid crystal mass spectrometry, is more suitable for forensic purposes and permits the identification of insulin analogues. Use of insulin as a murder weapon is exemplified by the case of Colin Norris, a male nurse found guilty of murdering 4 elderly patients and the attempted murder of a 5th by injecting them with insulin. However, the prosecution evidence against Norris was mainly circumstantial and hearsay. Toxicological evidence against Norris consisted of a high insulin C-peptide concentration ratio in plasma from one of the victims. This analysis was done by an immunoassay method at a clinical laboratory and not a forensic laboratory. Analytical procedures, including chain of custody routines, are far more stringent at forensic laboratories. Since his conviction, some of the medical evidence against Norris has been called into question, especially the prevalence of spontaneous attacks of hypoglycemia in elderly and frail patients with comorbidities. So most of that will be familiar to people who are aware of the Lucy Letby case, who've looked at the insulin cases, who know that this high insulin C-peptide concentration was significant, and also this immunoassay test, which we're going to go into in much more detail in future videos. So as early as 2011 here, you can see Angel of Death Colin Norris could be cleared of insulin murders. Of course, we're sitting here now in 2025, 14 years later, and he still hasn't been cleared. And it's not certain that it'll be cleared when this appeal takes place. Now, I've heard on the grapevine that there's a quiet confidence that he's going to win his appeal. And certainly, objectively, he should win his appeal because there's very strong exonerating evidence. But we don't know yet, and even if he does, he's had his young life taken away. I mean, I don't know his precise age now. So it says here he was 32 in 2008. So he would be, I wonder if it says on the Wikipedia page, when he was born, 1976. So he's 49 years old. So when he was first, these alleged murders took place in 2002 when he was 26 years old. And then he would have been arrested at about that age. And then his court case took place in his very early 30s. So all of his 30s are gone and all of his 40s are gone, even if he wins his appeal. So some more details here on this. He's very strongly claimed his innocence at the time, and there's something that we're going to go into more depth, but that's already been mentioned in the previous paper, that there's evidence that this conditions that supposedly occur due to insulin injection can occur due to natural occurring phenomena in elderly people. And Professor Marks points out there could easily be innocent explanation for the deaths. These patients all had other risk factors, which included emaciation, starvation, infection, cardiac arrest, renal failure. They were all at very high risk of developing spontaneous hypoglycemia. So, very different scenario from Lucy Letby in terms of the age of the patients, but the vulnerability is quite similar. And you actually see this same thing, all the patients had risk factors. You know, it's not 40-year-olds or 25-year-olds, people in prime health. It's people at the end of their lives, you know, in a nursing home. They're not very well. They've got comorbidities, etc., etc. So this article, I'll actually show you earlier on. It mentions Rebecca Layton, who was arrested at this time on suspicion of murdering patients and was eventually released without charge. So you can see an article about this from February 2013. So Rebecca Layton was also accused of poisoning patients. And again, she professed her innocence. And in this scenario, the system decided not to prosecute her. They decided not to come down hard on her. In fact, she spent 6 weeks in prison but was freed as there wasn't enough evidence against her. And they were satisfied that, you know, they just simply had no case. Now, I don't quite understand why she says here she's questioned by police investigating the poisoning of 22 patients. So perhaps what was missing here was the anecdotal evidence that they used to prejudice the jury. That's my assertion. The police would say, the criminal justice system would say, these are legitimate forms of evidence, whereas I would say, you know, looking at people's diaries is not legitimate. It's fucking nonsense. But, you know, I would suggest they probably just couldn't put enough together, and they knew that jury wouldn't be convinced because it was too tenuous. But it will be very similar to the Colin Norris case where they did prosecute, the Lucy Letby case where they have prosecuted, and other previous cases. Dee Windsor's one, Ben Geener's another. I'm not going to be examining every case because otherwise this video would be extremely long. It's just going to be focusing on Dee Windsor and Colin Norris. This individual even stole drugs, so God knows they would have held that against her in court. So it must have been really tenuous. But obviously, again, it's 22 people suffered hypoglycemia. It's always this thing about hypoglycemic episodes. 8 of these victims who were treated on acute care wards were seriously ill have now died. So that's why they became suspicious. And it says here, as we know, a second nurse who worked on the same wards, Victorino Chua, was later held on suspicion of 3 counts of murder and 18 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. Of course, we know Victorino Chua was eventually prosecuted. So anyway, I won't dwell on that too much more. I don't know too much about the Victorino Chua case. I know some people believe that it's another case of a miscarriage of justice. I'm not going to get into that in this video. I'm not going to get into the Ben Geen case. If I was going to get into every single case, it would be very long. I'm just going to concentrate on Colin Norris, but I just wanted to mention this case of Rebecca Layton, where they took someone in. They must have thought that it all added up. They must have thought, oh, she was on shift a lot, and then they ended up charging someone else. So I just wanted to highlight this as well before we go into more details about the Colin Norris case. So in January 2010, we saw this headline, "Trust Failings Allowed Nurse Colin Norris to Kill, Says Report." Does this sound familiar? 5 basic failures at hospital where Lucy Letby worked, inquiry told. Of course, we're seeing exactly the same thing of, oh, we made terrible mistakes and that's why Colin Norris was able to go on a killing spree. Just exactly the same as Lucy Letby. It's not, obviously I think there's no allegations with regard to Colin Norris that the hospital was incompetent. With in Lucy Letby's case, we know the hospital was very, very poor. So that's kind of the background to the Colin Norris case, but I'm going to go into more of the details related to this case and show the parallels between it and the Lucy Letby case. So to get into the Colin Norris case, the first obvious parallel with the Lucy Letby case is that he was and has been dubbed the Angel of Death. Obviously, we've had this silly Nurse Death name that's been associated with Lucy. There have been enormous efforts now to extricate Colin Norris from prison that began almost from the day he was convicted, because it wasn't just medical experts that believed him to be innocent. Many people that worked with him, many people that knew him, believed him to be innocent. We're going to get onto that shortly, but there were publications produced very shortly afterwards that indicated this could be an unsafe conviction. It was, in fact, at the time, compared to Sally Clark, certainly with regard to the use of statistics in the case, and it was, I think this was, although this didn't get anywhere near the level of publicity that Lucy Letby has received, I think it was kind of a bit of an opening of the floodgates where there was a recognition and understanding that there were a lot of unsafe convictions and there are a lot of people in prison who probably shouldn't be there. And it's not just nurses. Obviously, this is a focus of this channel and a focus of what I'm doing at the moment, but it really isn't just nurses. It's people across a wide variety of different backgrounds for a wide variety of different reasons. With regard to the statistical evidence at the time, Colin Norris's solicitor, who was called Jeremy Moore, commented that when there are cases against a defendant that are solely founded on the basis of expert evidence, and particularly when statistics are central to the case, there is unfortunately significant scope for juries to be misled. Statistical evidence can often be extremely persuasive to a jury, but at the same time misleading, unless there's been sufficient relevant research into the particular area and the jury is made fully aware of all the material on that research. Now, at this time that this was stated by this gentleman, I think this would have been certainly not common knowledge, and probably almost no one knew about this. Now, I think the Lucy Letby case has highlighted this, and the problems with expert evidence, the problem with expert witnesses in court, and the problem with juries being able to understand expert evidence, and the ability of expert witnesses and the willingness and commitment of expert witnesses towards communicating their evidence and their research in an appropriate manner. Statistics were particularly key to the Colin Norris case, and his lawyer cited the case of lawyer Sally Clark, that I'm sure people are familiar with, who was jailed for life after 2 of her babies died from what was ultimately proven to be cot death. This was yet another case of many cases involving this guy, Sir Roy Meadow, who testified that the chance of 2 children from an affluent family suddenly suffering infant death syndrome was 1 in 73 million. Now, I'm very surprised that that was allowed. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Maybe the word is disgusted, but I should be surprised that that was allowed to be in a courtroom, because, of course, Sir Roy Meadow is a paediatrician. He shouldn't be commenting on this at all. It's total rubbish. It's without foundation. If you're going to put that, just because he's deemed to be an expert, he shouldn't be commenting on anything and everything and asserting that as being an expert opinion. And this was absolutely critical in the case of Sally Clark. And then his work was later cited in the case of Kathleen Folbig, who I'll be discussing later on, and various others. But yeah, there's just absolutely no basis for this whatsoever. It was an utterly ridiculous assertion that he'd made on completely flawed mathematics and statistics, for which he was completely unqualified to give an opinion on. So at the time, the Royal Statistical Society issued this statement, and then later a publication warning about the misuse of statistics in courts and how serious that this was. In the case of Colin Norris, the condition of hypoglycemia is central to the whole thing, and his barrister argued, and I think this is pretty much undeniable, that the prosecution case made a similar argument to Sir Roy Meadow's now infamous Meadows Law, in which they asserted that the chances of hypoglycemia occurring naturally are extremely rare. So I've got an image there just showing the differences between hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. I do wish that they'd given whoever named these 2 conditions, I feel they could have made them rather, given them different names, not just called one hypoglycemia and one hyperglycemia. I understand that the base of that is in Latin, but still. So that explains the three typical blood conditions and glucose levels in the blood. So Colin Norris's lawyer commented, at the trial they paraded purported expert after expert, all of whom advised the jury that it was very unusual to see hypoglycemia in persons who are not diabetic. But then later, this gentleman, Professor Vincent Marks, who I mentioned earlier, was instructed, and he concluded that, contrary to what was believed at the time, spontaneous hypoglycemia is much, much, much higher than we believed at the time in elderly, frail, sick people, especially those with low body weight and suffering from malnutrition, which we know was the case with these patients. And then later on, it turned out that they had numerous morbidities. In fact, there was little reason to believe that hypoglycemia was anything other than a spontaneous response to their underlying illnesses. So this entire case of Colin Norris hinges on the artificial injection of insulin, but really the conditions that are measured at the time were just a natural occurring phenomenon that was a response to essentially their anatomical conditions. Another critical aspect of this that we'll see a clear parallel with to the Lucy Letby case was the argument that Colin Norris was the common denominator in all 5 cases because he was on duty when the low blood sugar developed. So we see the argument being made here with regard to Lucy Letby. It was further claimed that severe hypoglycemia was so rare that it could only possibly be explained by a massive dose of insulin or the diabetic medication having been administered externally. The statistical coincidence theory that was used in this case is extremely similar to Lucy Letby. What we have seen in this case, according to an article I read that was published on the Justice Gap, was an admission by the West Yorkshire Police, who investigated the case, that Colin Norris was the subject of the investigation, that they had speculated that he was a serial killer before they had any plausible concrete evidence, and that he was the subject of the investigation. And of course, I think people will be aware of this, but I will make videos on this aspect of the case as well, the statistical case and the coincidence theory case and the chart that you're seeing on the screen now. But beginning from that presumption, just as I strongly believe, and I believe it can be virtually completely proven, that Cheshire police began with an assumption that Lucy Letby was a serial killer, that obviously introduces massive bias into the investigation. So inevitably, the investigation comes to a predetermined conclusion. That's what happened with Colin Norris, and it's what happened with Lucy Letby. So in the Lucy Letby case, you see all these ridiculous things like them digging up a garden and going through a guttering and stuff that really serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever. What were they expecting to find, or what could they find? And of course, the answer is they found absolutely nothing. There was no basis to do this. What possible justification could there be for a forensic investigation? Now, Peter Hitchens has suggested they just wanted some good visuals to leak to the media. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but it certainly sounds very plausible. But we see, this is an earlier warning with the Colin Norris case, of the danger of conclusion-driven police investigations and how they can lead to the conviction of innocent people. And we see all the way through the Operation Hummingbird video that was released by Cheshire Police that I will analyse eventually. The presence of bias in that investigation is tangible, just in that hour of them talking about it. So God knows what it was like over the months and years that they were investigating. It must have been, they must have been constantly talking about this conclusion that they'd basically already drawn before they even started. And this is definitely what has occurred in the Colin Norris case, and it seems that there is more on the record in his case as well. So one of the assertions that was made with regard to this case is that the Colin Norris conviction highlights problems with expert evidence in the adversarial trial system. The Lucy Letby case has further highlighted this. It's very important that expert witnesses give accurate statements and that they're not too flippant about the likelihood of certain things happening. And they make it clear that something is an opinion rather than a fact, particularly when it's not a fact. And there's a comment in the Justice Gap about, after months of testimony, the jury at the trial may have felt blinded by science. Now, I'm certain this happened in Lucy Letby's case, except that it was a much longer trial. So by the end of it, the chance of them being able to truly understand everything they've heard, even if it was explained to them possibly, is very slim. And of course, it wasn't explained properly, just as it wasn't explained properly in the Norris case, which is why you have these organisations such as the Royal Statistical Society and the Law Commission publishing statements and publishing documents explaining the dangers inherent in what has occurred in these cases. But because this happened, we know for a fact, this court case happened in 2008, and we've seen the blueprint for this case essentially copied again to convict Lucy Letby with all the same mistakes, all the same biases, all the same problems, just repeated all over again with absolutely nothing being learnt whatsoever. The only difference really in this case was two basic differences. The first difference is that it's patients of a different age, and then the second difference is, well, there's a third one. I was going to say there's two, but the second one is there's more methods of murder in the Lucy Letby case, and then the third one is at least Colin Norris had the BBC come out on his side, and they did a proper panorama documentary. It hasn't helped as of yet, although he's got his appeal coming up soon. But in the Lucy Letby case, the BBC has, I think, behaved despicably, particularly considering that virtually every other media outlet has at least published something useful. So it's kind of chilling to just see the same patterns repeating over and over again and nothing being learnt. And of course, this isn't the first case. There's other cases, and I'm going to discuss some of those cases later in the video. So I'm going to read a passage from the article that was published in the Justice Gap. In a 2011 article for a policing journal, a senior West Yorkshire officer conducting the investigation into Colin Norris claimed initial inquiries on the ward revealed 2 other patients had died under similar circumstances and that Colin had been on duty in the ward when the patients suffered hypoglycemic episodes. I'm sure these arguments are very familiar to people from the Lucy Letby case. This assertion is simply untrue. In the course of a 5-year investigation, West Yorkshire Police took a remarkable 7,212 witness statements. Not a single one corroborates the claim regarding initial inquiries by West Yorkshire Police. There were few, if any, similarities between the deaths of the patients named in the article and the demise of Mrs. Hull, nor were the 2 women's blood samples subjected to laboratory analysis. Again, we've seen this happen again in the Letby case I'll be getting into later in these videos. Colin was re-arrested and interviewed by police on another 5 occasions over the next 3 years. So I think Lucy Letby was interviewed for nearly 24 hours. It was something like 23 hours, 48 minutes. And she was re-arrested numerous times and denied bail. We saw exactly the same thing occurring here. And this article in the Justice Gap concludes that the exercise was conclusion driven from the start, which you could say the same thing about Lucy Letby. So the interesting thing is the police are going around saying, oh, it has to be Colin Norris because he's on duty for all these incidents. Again, exactly the same thing that happened in the Lucy Letby case. And then these people were contacted. So we hear from them in the Panorama documentary. I'll discuss a little bit more about that towards the end of this video. But these 2 people had a very elderly relative who passed away, and they were told, oh, your grandmother and your mother has been murdered by Colin Norris. Then later on, they found out that Colin Norris wasn't on duty, and they just told them, oh, never mind, he's not on duty, we're wrong, he hasn't been murdered. And they dropped it completely. Now, unfortunately, we haven't seen that happen in the Lucy Letby case, but I think many people, including myself, suspect that very similar things have occurred in that case, and it was always a suspect-led investigation. And there's very strong evidence pointing to that now. That it's got stronger and stronger and stronger, and we can be quite confident that there was enormous bias in the Lucy Letby investigation from day one. Clearly, in the Colin Norris investigation, it's undeniable, because they've contacted these 2 people and said, oh, Colin Norris is, oh, never mind, it's not Colin Norris, was somewhere else at the time, so we'll just conclude it's not a murder now. You can't really believe these type of things happen, but one genuinely wonders what the police motivation is, whether they just are so thick they can't understand the problems with their own investigations, or whether it's they're so determined to get a suspect so they don't want to have a murderer on the loose, or it's just very hard to say. I personally think one possible element of it is that they're surrounded by crime to such an extent they start believing everything is a crime. It's a kind of psychological degradation into a situation where they can't recognise innocent people and they can't recognise innocent situations anymore. I don't know what the motivation is. I don't know what the reasons are for it. It could be a combination of these things. It could be other things as well. But it's a pretty bad situation where they're saying, oh, our evidence is that Colin Norris is always on duty. Oh, guess what? Colin Norris has killed your grandmother. Oh, no, wait a minute, he wasn't on duty. Therefore, it can't have been a murder. I mean, this is a fairly farcical situation. I think anyone would agree. The next point relates to Colin Norris' case was that evidence relating to insulin autoimmune syndrome appeared at a later date. And in the initial court case, it was asserted that this was extremely rare, but it's become clear since Colin Norris was convicted that it was far less rare than was suggested at the time. It's not an extreme rarity, and that it's actually quite common in elderly hospital patients, particularly those with comorbidities, and that people like this may experience hypoglycemia in their final stages of life. The reason this hadn't been discovered before then was simply because no one had ever looked for it. Like many scientific developments and like many innovations in the medical field, it's something that developed over a period of time. And prior to the point where it's discovered and understood, no one knows anything about it at all. This also applies to the case of Kathleen Folbig, as I'll explain towards the end of the video. And then following the appeal of Colin Norris, Professor Vincent Marks came out and provided some information indicating that spontaneous hypoglycemia can occur with some regularity in elderly patients, particularly when they have these risk factors and serious conditions. And these findings were submitted to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, and eventually, I mean, it was 10 years after this was submitted by Professor Marks, 10 years later, the Criminal Cases Review Commission finally referred this case to the Court of Appeal. So in 2011, excuse me, the Law Commission published this report, Expert Evidence in Criminal Proceedings in England and Wales. This report acknowledged problems with the admissibility of expert evidence in court. The report's conclusions were almost universally applauded by those involved in criminal justice, including judges, scientists, other experts, prosecution and defence lawyers, and solicitors. The key recommendation was that courts conduct pre-trial hearings at which the reliability of expert evidence will be probed, and this can include inquiry into whether proposed testimony is supported by a sufficiently firm body of research. Now, of course, if this recommendation had been included in the Lucy Letby case, it never would have gone to court, because as soon as Dr. Evans turned up with his, she might have injected 45 millilitres of milk, or she might have done this with air, there wouldn't have been a body of evidence that supported it, because it's almost impossible to find any academic research. And as we know, the only paper that he really used in support of it diagnostically is Dr. Shu Lee's paper that obviously Dr. Shu Lee's now come out very strongly in favour of the defence. So it's essential for this to be implemented. It's suggested here in this Justice Gap article that if the proposed system had been in place before the trial of Colin Norris, the absence of confirmatory research to support the alleged rarity of non-diabetic hypoglycemia would have become apparent. The expert's testimony might have been ruled inadmissible. But despite the fact that almost everyone believed that this recommendation should have been implemented, the following gentleman, Chris Grayling, a handsome fellow, I'm sure you'll agree, he rejected the report, claiming that pre-trial hearings would simply cost too much. This is despite the fact that people that are experts in the legal system said it's more likely to save money having pre-trial hearings, but he just refused to listen to this argument and blocked the recommendations. Now, these recommendations should have been implemented. They still should be implemented now. And if you want to get to the truth, if you want the criminal justice system to get to the truth of a situation in a case involving scientific and medical evidence, at the very least, the recommendations of the Law Commission must be implemented sooner rather than later. Now, we've heard Dr. Philip Hammond speaking about this. We've heard Sir David Davies speaking about this. When this Lucy Letby situation is sorted out, this is something that simply must happen. And I'll definitely be campaigning for that, and I think several other people will be as well. So here's a picture of Colin. In common with Lucy as well, and yet another parallel with the Lucy Letby case is that he continues to be supported by his father, many friends, many nurses, none of whom believe that he could possibly have committed the offences for which he has been convicted and remains imprisoned. And it was interesting to note that one final thing I'll mention, another parallel, was that the trial judge in the Colin Norris case advised the jurors that they could deliver a majority verdict, which of course happened in the Lucy Letby case, and it happened in the Andrew Malkinson case. I don't know why there's been this sudden decision that we should have majority verdicts, because it's known, there's research into this that indicates majority verdicts are more likely to result in miscarriages of justice. So it's another bizarre aspect of the case, and another mirroring of what occurred in Lucy Letby's case. So finally, I'm going to discuss some details related to the Panorama programme that was made about Colin Norris, I believe in 2011, around the time when his appeals began. It's definitely worth watching. It's on YouTube. I've got the video up here. And the first thing I'll mention before I actually go into specific details is someone told me something about this, which is quite interesting, which is that originally this programme was going to be quite significantly different from how it ultimately was. But they had, I think, I'm not sure if it was one of the prosecutors or the expert witnesses, probably the latter, was going to be interviewed by the BBC. And basically, I think he was asked one question and walked out. So he couldn't be in the programme because he's realised he couldn't answer the questions. And so they had to make it completely different. to how it was. Not many people know that, but it's absolutely true. So the first thing you see, this is a screenshot, a screen capture from the Panorama program, just subtitled, so I can make this point clear. I could probably take clips out of Panorama, but I don't know how copyright works, so I'd rather just keep it as safe as possible. Because if at any point I start getting copyright strikes, I don't know how to resolve them or what to do with them, so I'm just going to keep it simple. So this is a screenshot from Panorama, and you see here the narrator talking about the cherry picking of cases. So you don't get a much bigger example of cherry picking than going to someone and saying, your grandmother was murdered. Oh, never mind, the wrong person wasn't on duty at that time. And we obviously strongly suspect this has occurred in the Lucy Letby case, similar cherry picking of both deaths and collapses. You see here someone that became involved in the defence of Colin Norris stating that the testing used, which is simply not a valid test. We're going to discuss this later in these series of videos. It equally applies to Lucy Letby's trial and Lucy Letby's case. So talking about the cherry picking, we see here this statement during the Panorama programme, deaths in which the suspect Norris had attended at the time of death or at the time leading up to the death were prioritised. So it's this reverse engineering of the case that, again, due to what we know about the Lucy Letby case, due to what the police have told us, due to various aspects of the case, we believe that this has happened again with the Lucy Letby case. This guy here just reiterating his opinion that the lack of validity of the test would be the view of biochemists the world over. We're now seeing that repeated yet again in the Lucy Letby case. Now, this is an interesting point here made by Professor Vincent Marks, that, as I mentioned earlier, some of the information that came up with regard to hypoglycemia and other aspects of the science wasn't well known at the time of the trial. So I'm going to return to the Kathleen Folbig case that I mentioned earlier. Now, this was an Australian woman who was found guilty in 2003 by the Supreme Court of New South Wales of 3 counts of murder, 1 count of manslaughter, 1 count of maliciously inflicting grievous bodily harm with regard to her own children. She was eventually exonerated nearly 20 years later due to genetic testing and genetic research. Now, at the time of her investigation and then the trial and then her incarceration, this genetic testing, not only was it not available, but the actual knowledge didn't exist, because genetic testing and genetic investigation is advancing all the time. I was fortunate enough to attend an event at the Francis Crick Institute, which is a big centre of genetic investigation and genetic research, and they're making breakthroughs all the time. So this is just a kind of summary of how genetic research is developing all the time. So there are significant advancements in genetic research leading to identification of numerous previously unknown genetic conditions over the last 20 years. Even this year, there's been a study identifying 69 previously unknown genetic determinants of rare diseases. The Deciphering Developmental Disorders study has diagnosed over 5,500 children, leading to the identification of 60 previously unknown medical conditions. A German study revealed 34 new previously unknown genetic diseases just last year. In 2020, researchers presented evidence for 28 novel development disorders by analysing exome sequences from 31,000 parent-offspring trios. And then here, there's more indication that a recent study reported by the World Economic Forum identified over 275 million previously unknown genetic variants. So with regard to this, I've been told by one of the most eminent geneticists in the world that there are probably thousands and maybe tens of thousands of unknown genetic conditions that we're going to steadily uncover in the years to come through this very complex research that can only be done by experts, in teams of experts, with professors, with doctors, with students, PhD students, people working in tandem to uncover these new conditions. So unfortunately, in the case of Kathleen Folbig, when she went to prison, the genetic conditions that her children who had unfortunately died turned out to have wasn't known about, and it certainly couldn't be proven. And it was only through genetic advancements and developments in the years that followed that they were able to put a team together, and that team eventually exonerated her, although it took nearly 20 years. And she had a failed appeal in 2011. She had several failed appeals, but she particularly had one in 2011 when, I mean, I'll probably make a video on this at some point, so I won't go into too much detail, but I mean, frankly, it's farcical. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But yeah, it's important to understand that we're still uncovering and discovering new genetic conditions that can explain the deaths of infants, that can explain certain outcomes that were previously unknown and not understood. And in the case of Colin Norris, unfortunately for him, when he went to court, some of the science that's since been used in his defence wasn't available, and now it is available. It's still taken the Court of Appeal an enormous amount of time and the Criminal Case Review Commission to deal with this. And this is why we hope, in the case of Lucy Letby, the enormous amount of publicity, the enormous amount of criticism, the fact that these previous cases have highlighted the same mistakes, we're hopeful that collectively this will result in a faster decision, and hopefully a much faster decision. So I also just finally wanted to finish by highlighting a few other cases. So Sam Hallam, this is nothing to do with nurses, nothing to do with insulin, but he was simply jailed for a murder where he wasn't at the crime scene. So I've interviewed this gentleman, Michael O'Brien. It was a real privilege to me. He was an incredible person, very inspiring. He was wrongly jailed for 11 years for allegedly beating a newsagent to death. Again, he wasn't at the crime scene. He just simply was not at the crime scene. And yet he still spent 11 years in prison. This is Andrew Malkinson. He spent 17 years in prison. Again, he simply wasn't at the crime scene at the time the crime was committed. So it's not, there are an enormous number, I would say, of miscarriages of justice. There have been hundreds that are proven. There are thousands of cases waiting to be heard. God knows how many people have been wrongly convicted. And when you have a case like this where there was literally no evidence, in the Malkinson case, there was literally no evidence. He still served 17 years. He still had 3 appeals rejected. Evidence was withheld that could have exonerated him. It's quite clear that the appeal system is unsatisfactory, inadequate, not fit for purpose, I would say bordering on shambolic at times. And yet they will still uphold these cases, such as the Malkinson case. Colin Norris's case has taken an enormous amount of time to resolve. And it's very worrying, it's very disturbing. And as I say, in the case of Colin Norris, we don't even know if he's going to win his appeal yet. We'll have to wait and see. And obviously it'd be very positive for Lucy if he did. But there are obvious and multiple parallels between the Colin Norris case and the Lucy Letby case. And what we see from these cases is that all of the evidence related to insulin, as flawed as it is, as criticised as it has been, as much as experts have come out and said, look, it's completely wrong, you've made all kinds of mistakes, etc., despite all of that, it's not new. It's been done before, and the people it's been done to before are still in prison. So that is possibly the most egregious aspect of this whole thing. If it was completely new, it would still be really bad, obviously. But the fact that Lucy Letby is being convicted on stuff that we know, it goes back 20, 25 years to previous cases where we know the science is flawed, we know the testing is flawed, we know these people are likely innocent, and yet they still haven't been exonerated, and yet we'll repeat the thing over and over again. And there is a woman on remand now, a nurse in Birmingham, and they wanted to charge her, and they haven't charged her yet. And I think that's probably likely because of this Lucy Letby case, and they probably realise, well, we'd better wait and see what's going to happen there because we don't want to drop yet another clanger. But it's something that I came to realise about the Lucy Letby cases. It's very sad and it's awful what's happened to Lucy, but it's just something that had to happen. And I'm really sorry that someone like Lucy, who appears to be a really good person, has got embroiled in this and immersed in a horrible situation, and that she's a sacrificial lamb to a certain extent. But if this isn't addressed, it will happen over and over and over again indefinitely. If the specifics about insulin are not addressed, if these nurse serial killer cases are not addressed, and if at the very least the Law Commission recommendations are not implemented, hopefully with further reforms of the criminal justice system as well, we're going to see these cases occurring over and over again, not only in relation to nurses, but in relation to other people as well. But I think particularly there can be further nurse serial killer cases, clearly, because every time there's a spike, it can be considered suspicious. And God knows what the Thirlwell inquiry is going to recommend in November when they're supposed to release the recommendations. Who knows what they're going to say, and who knows what kind of dangerous conclusions are going to be drawn from this inquiry that has been just a farce from start to finish, really. So I do believe that Lucy Letby, if she'd have gone for constructive dismissal, after she had a grievance procedure and all 7 points were upheld, if she'd have gone for constructive dismissal, which it might, if it were me, I would not go back to work on a unit in which people have been making unsubstantiated allegations that I've been trying to kill babies. There's no way. I'm done with that hospital forever. Lucy, obviously, is a very defiant person, and she wanted to say, I've done nothing wrong, I've got no reason to feel bad, I'm going to go back onto this unit. I think that was a bit naive and unrealistic, because if people are capable of doing that, then what else are they capable of doing? How could you ever be safe? And she should have gone for constructive dismissal, and if she had, I don't think she'd be in prison today. I wouldn't be making this video, and we never would have heard the name Lucy Letby. I think that's very likely. However, I think simply another nurse would have been fingered for a similar thing, and the case would have what we've seen with Lucy Letby would have happened all over again. The thing that has made it clear with Lucy Letby has been the scope of the number of allegations, the different types of allegations, the ridiculous nature of some of these allegations. That is what alerted me to the case initially, and I'm sure many others. And if it had just been a normal insulin poisoning, as has happened in other cases, it might have passed me by, it might have passed others by, it might not have become as big as quickly as it has, there might not have been as many people coming out in support of Lucy, and it could have passed relatively under the radar, and then it could happen to other people. And, it's terrible what's happened to Lucy, but this needs to be addressed. I mean, this cannot continue. We can't have... I've just shown you two historical cases, and I mentioned Victorino Chua, and there's other people, there's Ben Geen. This cannot continue. It cannot continue. It's absolutely ridiculous. We've yet to get any of these people out of prison. Colin Norris hopefully is going to become the first. This has to be addressed. There has to be reform of the criminal justice system. We cannot brush this under the carpet anymore. It's just something that simply needs to be met head on. We need to take the bull by the horns and accept and acknowledge that the criminal justice system is failing. And it's definitely failing with regard to nurses. It's definitely failing with regard to these insulin cases. And it couldn't be clearer, because in this video, I've talked about two cases, one of which is nearly 25 years old, and one of which is nearly 20 years old. And they're literally showing exactly the same pattern of mistakes, exactly the same blueprint, exactly the same type of investigation in Colin Norris as now has occurred in Lucy Letby. And nothing has been learnt whatsoever. And now we've got another person in prison in the shape of Lucy Letby. So this is a horrible situation. I feel with all my heart for Lucy, because I can't imagine how horrible it is. I've spoken, as I say, to Michael O'Brien. He shared a lot of stuff with me. It was very moving. It was very humbling to speak with him, an incredibly strong and inspirational person. And, I don't mind admitting that I would have cried if it were not for the fact that I knew I needed to hold myself together. So I didn't cry, but it was really emotional. And there can't be anything worse than going to prison as an innocent person for murder. And it's happened to several people in this country who have been exonerated. And there hasn't been a serial killer exoneration yet, but there are serial killers in prison now. Very strong evidence of innocence that applies to Colin Norris. It applies to Lucy Letby. I don't know as much about the Ben Geen case, but people that have studied it believe that he's innocent. I don't know as much about the Chua case, but again, people believe that Victorino Chua is innocent. But I know in the case of Dee Windsor, Colin Norris, Lucy Letby, there's overwhelming evidence of innocence. I've spoken to one of the key people from the Norris and Windsor case. He told me that they're both definitely innocent, not just because of science, but because of logistical reasons as well. I now 100% believe Lucy Letby's innocent. And, it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous, but this is something that we have to address. And, I will dedicate the rest of my life to it until it's properly dealt with and properly addressed. And at least there's a better chance that in Britain you can have a fair trial. Because I grew up believing that, and I just don't believe it anymore. So I just want to finish this video with a very quick summary. So firstly, we've established there have been several previous convictions of insulin poisoning that are similar to the Lucy Letby case and which are obvious miscarriages of justice. All of the same mistakes from the Lucy Letby case were made in these cases, and the same pattern of investigation is quite evident in the Colin Norris case. There has hitherto been an unwillingness within the criminal justice system to address the scientific and evidential flaws in these cases. The latest appeal of Colin Norris will be heard in May, with Norris having very strong exonerating evidence in his favour. It seems that the outcome of this case could be critical for the prospects of Lucy Letby. And it's clear that both reformation of the criminal justice system and a greater awareness of the flawed science and investigation of these cases must be implemented if further erroneous convictions are to be avoided. So that's a pretty detailed insight into the context of the insulin cases and how they've been mirrored and echoed in previous convictions and previous investigations. I'm not sure if there is a blueprint for these cases for police investigation, or if individual police bodies just make the same mistakes, or if they don't understand that the previous cases are unsound. It's really hard to know what goes on with the police, because it's quite clear from Cheshire Police and their attitude towards the Letby inquiry that they've abandoned any concept of being a public serving body or having any degree of transparency. So I don't know, but what I do know is that there have been several cases where there have been these investigations that are completely flawed and they've resulted in these flawed convictions, and Lucy Letby is just the latest. I'll definitely be following the Colin Norris appeal very closely. Fingers crossed that he's exonerated. I must say that if he's not exonerated, it's a significant problem for Lucy Letby, because there's very similar evidence in the two cases, slightly different because in the Colin Norris case, they're using evidence related to the patients being elderly and being vulnerable to hypoglycemia, whereas the Letby case will use slightly different evidence, but still very similar. There are certain people that are involved in both. I mean, the Letby case has got an enormous amount of experts involved, but we also have to say that at this point in time, none of these cases have been overturned. I don't think a serial killer has ever been exonerated in Britain. It's going to be a challenge, and it would help a lot if Colin Norris was exonerated, as he should be, as someone who is clearly innocent. So that's all I have to say in this video. I'm going to be moving on to make a series of videos about the insulin cases. The next one will begin to look at the specific circumstances in Lucy Letby's case. I'm going to intersperse this with some shorter videos, because I made a 15-minute video regarding just a demonstration of how flawed the case against Lucy Letby is, and people seem to like that. So I'll do some longer videos and some shorter videos and kind of alternate between the two. Obviously, actually that last 15-minute video was a nightmare to edit. So it actually took just as long to make as one that lasts over an hour. So that was quite annoying. So I think in future videos I'll try to make them easier to edit, because I'm not amazing at editing, not by a long chalk. But I do think making some short videos, theoretically they should be easier to make. And then I can make more videos and have more time to research and record and edit the longer videos. But as always, I'll just finish this by saying thank you for the support. Can I just mention, I might mention this at the start of a video in the future, but if you haven't subscribed, it would be really nice if you could just subscribe. I'm very new to YouTube and I didn't expect to get subscribers, and I didn't really understand the significance of subscribers, but I've done a little bit of research trying to understand YouTube better, because as an example, when I post videos, they still get, there's options that I'm supposed to use and they're greyed out. I don't really know why. So I'm still trying to understand that, for example. But I did a little bit of research into how you get more people to see your videos, and I'm very grateful for the response. I didn't expect to get like 1,000 views for every video and 4,000 for the most, and it's a lot more than I expected, and people have subscribed, and it's really nice. But when I did a bit of research to try and work out what I'm doing right and what I could do better, all of these sites that explain that know YouTube inside out say, oh, you know, your subscribers will be a certain, sorry, your video views will be a certain percentage of your subscribers, and I'm looking at them like my video views are double my subscribers at least. So that's not, you know, that's good because it means people are watching them, but apparently if you get more subscribers, it's good for the algorithms. So I think if you get to 1,000, something happens. Don't ask me what it is. So yeah, so if people can subscribe if they haven't, then that'd be really nice. But it's not the end of the world. You don't have to do if you don't want to, but it would be obviously appreciated. And I'd like to continue to grow the channel and have more people see the videos. And apparently, the best way to do that is people to like, subscribe, and comment. So if you could, people have liked a lot and people have commented a lot. People have subscribed a lot, but I still have like double the views for a video that I've got for subscribers. So apparently, you're supposed to have more subscribers than views. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Apart from that, I really appreciate the support. Hugely appreciative. And if you have any comments, queries, observations, corrections, please do leave them because I read everything, try to react to everything. So thanks again.